Welcome to Great Minds with Lost and Found, the podcast that connects people and reimagines systems to improve mental health for youth and young adults. I'm your host, Joel Kaskinen. Lost and Found is a comprehensive nonprofit organization that aims to do more to eliminate suicide for youth and young adults in the United States. Now that you know who we are and what we're all about, let's get to the show. Welcome back to Great Minds with Lost and Found, the podcast where we connect people and reimagine systems. I'm your host, Joel Kaskinen, and today I have the privilege of having my supervisor and fellow colleague from Lost and Found, Heidi Marttila-Losure. Heidi, will you just do a brief intro of who you are and your role at Lost and Found and kind of why you're here to talk to us today?
So thanks, Joel. It's great to be on the show. My title with Lost and Found is Director of Communications. And so we're here to talk about our 30 Days, 30 Stories project, which will be starting soon, and storytelling in general is what I'm going to talk about today. So I will start with a little bit about my own story. My story, like a lot of kids who grew up in rural places, is the story of departure and return. Not all rural kids have the return part, but my story does. I grew up on a farm in Frederick, South Dakota, the same farm that I have now moved back to. And in those years, they were just not good years for farming. So the idea of staying on the farm just really didn't seem like an option in those years. So I went off to college to Minnesota. I went to Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, studied English writing and religion, and also worked on the school newspaper there. And then moved to North Carolina with my soon-to-be husband, worked at a daily newspaper in Asheville, North Carolina. And then when he started grad school, after we'd already gotten married at that time, we went to Ames, Iowa, and I worked at a daily newspaper there. And in that time, I really got into rural issues and people who would write about those things, like Michael Pollan and Wendell Berry. And so we started talking about moving back to a farm somewhere. And when the opportunity arose, we moved back to my family's farm. My husband was able to get a job nearby. So that was a particularly crazy time. We're leaving two good jobs. Both of us had jobs with benefits in Iowa. Moving back to when I started freelancing then. My husband was starting a new job in a slightly different field. My daughter had been born at that time. She was a toddler too, so that was a bit of a handful. I was expecting my son, and we moved in with my parents. And we started working on building a house. And so it's pretty much like a significant number of the stressful things you could think about happening in a person's life. We just crammed all into one little time period there. So we were planning on building a house from the ground up, but we didn't actually end up doing that. We transformed the granary on my family's farm into our house, and that is where we live today. As far as my work goes, I had been freelancing when my kids were small, and then I started working on this project called Dakota Fire, which was a rural journalism project. We looked at some of the problems affecting rural places, and then also kind of dove deep into what solutions we could find to help rural places be better. We worked with weekly newspaper journalists on that project. It ran for 5 years. 4.5 of those years, it was grant funded, and then we tried really hard to make it sustainable for another 6 months, and we're not able to do so. So that ended at 5 years, and I went back to freelancing. And one of the projects that I was doing as I was freelancing was for this fledgling but growing nonprofit called Lost and Found. And I started just a few hours a week, and that grew over time, over 4 years. And at the beginning of this past year, I moved into a full-time role with Lost and Found. So beyond that work, one of my interests is high school sports photography, which is a different kind of storytelling. I'm always looking for the image that will tell the story of the game, but then also, each of the players out there is living out their own story. And so I'm always looking at, trying to tell those stories as well.
All right. Well, Heidi, you have a wealth of experience when it comes to communications and storytelling, which is huge because when we started this project, the 30 Days, 30 Stories project, we really wanted to focus on the storytelling aspect of suicide prevention and how those two worlds kind of combine. So, for those of our listeners that don't know what this project is, every National Suicide Prevention Month, which is September annually, we have done this now. It's our third year, our third iteration of this project, and we find 30 South Dakotans who want to share their lived experience, whether that is suicide ideation, that's an attempt, a loss of suicide, grief, trauma, loss, etc. Really, we want to tackle stories of lived experiences of mental illness and mental health. And so we believe that storytelling is part of suicide prevention, and that's why we decided to do this project. So from your perspective, Heidi, as a communications professional and former journalist, what is the importance of storytelling culturally and in terms of human connection?
Okay, so first, from my perspective, as a former journalist, one of the essential ideas of journalism is that you need stories or human examples to make pretty much any news story work. Facts and figures matter because without the facts and figures, any story could just be dismissed as an anecdote. You wouldn't know if it was just one person saying that or if this represented a whole group of people. But facts and figures by themselves have no power unless they also have a human story with them to really be effective. Facts and figures can make you think, but stories can make you feel. And you really need both of those to help people understand and make use of whatever information you're providing as a journalist. And then from a larger human perspective, stories are a vital part of what make us human. They help us make meaning of the world and our place in it. One of the things that I learned while I was researching this, I came across video by Kurt Vonnegut, who he gave some seminars talking about stories, and he basically talked about there are 8 or so different story arcs, and pretty much every story fits into one of those.
Sure.
Like, for example, the hero's arc. So it starts with a hero, somebody who is going along in life, and life is pretty good. Something happens. The hero needs to go on a quest to figure out, how to solve this problem, and things go bad on the quest, and they have to change something within themselves in order to be able to solve whatever challenges they are, and they're able to eventually come back and conquer and end up in a better place than they were at the beginning of the story. So that's just an example of one of those story arcs. But like all of our stories fit into some sort of, human stories always have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And so when we map our lives onto some kind of a story, it helps us understand where we are and who we are in relation to what's going on in our lives. Stories also really connect us to one another, and that is vitally important, especially today. The U.S. Surgeon General has said that right now we are living in an epidemic of loneliness in this country. And we're all connected all the time online on our devices, right? But that's not really connecting one-on-one to other people. And as humans, we are social beings, and we really crave that connection with other people, and we're not getting it in the way our society is structured today. And that absolutely has a connection to our epidemic of mental health struggles, as well as suicide in the U.S. today. Stories are not going to be the final answer to that, but they're part of that, right? We can help build connection through stories, and that can help with some of these bigger issues as well. I've been reading up on stories in preparation for our 30 Days, 30 Stories project, and that includes this book called Between the Listening and the Telling. It's by Mark Yaconelli. I was going to read you just a little bit from this, if that's all right.
Yeah.
The part that really seems to get at the heart of this. We are relational beings. We need others in order to become ourselves. We need relationships to access the deepest gifts of our humanity. We need relationships to live lives that are productive, loving, and meaningful. Sharing stories is how we make a home within ourselves and one another. Story is how we put together the broken pieces. Story is how we identify and heal the suffering within and among us. The practice of storytelling, particularly when sharing the real stories from our own living, tethers us to what matters most: our families, our friends, nature, the hearts we carry, the wondrous mystery of life itself. Every human being longs for a good question and a listening ear. That one is so good.
I love that
Every
one.
human being longs for a good question and a listening ear. Where did you like to hide as a child? When was a time you felt deeply betrayed? Where was the place that you felt most like home? Who was the love that got away? How did you find yourself in this town? When was the last time you felt truly alive? So, yeah, if you think about those questions, I mean, how often do we actually ask things like that and make time
Not
to
often.
listen? Not often enough, certainly. So that's the power from the teller's perspective, the power of stories. From a listener's perspective, stories can change how we see one another. A good story can draw a circle of connection around two people that you wouldn't otherwise think really had anything in common. And when a person hears themselves in somebody else's story, that person is no longer an other like they might have been before. So there's one more paragraph I'm going to read on this one too.
Great.
So,
I can't wait.
This is a very good book. I found all sorts of tidbits in it. All right. This is how stories can save us. We step into the reality of another person's existence and instead of judgment, feel kinship. When we say, "Tell me your story," we're really asking, "Can I relive your experience with you? Can I try and see as you have seen, feel as you have felt, know the world as you have known it?" The honest listening and telling of personal experiences naturally endears us to one another. The illusion of separateness dissipates, and we see ourselves in one another's story. When that happens, we are no longer able to demonize, ridicule, oppress, or neglect the other. This is not rocket science. This capacity is a natural, hardwired human inclination that anyone can engage. And when we do, we can heal our families, our world, ourselves.
So true. Wow. Look at that book. I'm going to have to steal that book.
I can share it when we're done here. Yeah, it's a great book.
Wow. So, yeah, that really hit the point that we're trying to make here and drive the point home that, stories really are human connecting. And that human connection is what we're striving to find in the healing process of suicide prevention. So that brings me to my next question. With the goal of normalizing the conversation around mental illness and suicide, this project uses the stories of South Dakotans living with mental illness, grief, trauma, loss, etc., to power others and to ask them, encourage them, empower others to share their own story. So what makes this effective, and why do you feel that this storytelling or storytelling in general is effective in the work that we do?
Okay, so I'm going to start with just looking at our work from Lost and Found before we get to our 30 Days, 30 Stories project. On a practical level, as a nonprofit, we have to be able to be good at telling our own story. Every nonprofit is essentially telling a story about a problem that they see in the world and how that nonprofit is working to make it better. And that's really what any nonprofit supporters are supporting, is becoming a part of that story, helping to help that story develop and go forward. Lost and Found story starts with our roots as a student organization, and students seeing a problem with other students and working to solve it is a very powerful story. Eric Muckey is going to be talking a little more about that on a future podcast episode. So you'll hear more about that from him. And then if we think about the work that Lost and Found does beyond this 30 Days, 30 Stories project, we are helping people reframe their own stories. So if we think about our peer-to-peer mentorship program, a student who might be struggling with the adjustment to college life becomes a student who has a friend, who has a mentor, somebody who cares about them and is helping them develop good habits. And then on the other side of that, a student who sees some problems with friends or other people in college becomes a helper instead of someone just who feels helpless in the face of a problem. They become a helper in trying to solve that. And then through our Survivors Joining for Hope program, families who have lost someone to suicide, who have been thrust into a really horrible storyline, get some help and support that can help them start to reimagine what their story is going forward. We're there at the critical moment when they might not be able to see that their story could be a little bit of a different one. So then, turning to our 30 Days, 30 Stories project, that's where we're really wielding the power of stories to move forward toward healing and wholeness. And I think that goes for both the people who are telling the stories as well as the people who are hearing those stories. Another book I've been reading, so I'm working on this project, is called The Healing Power of Storytelling by Annie Brewster. And she is a doctor who discovered the power of storytelling when she herself was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And she talks about the many ways that storytelling can improve mental health. Storytelling builds connection, as we talked about earlier, which that has huge implications for mental health. It also empowers the storyteller, and it builds agency, which means the idea that we have power to make change in the world, to have an effect on the world. Jonathan Adler, who is a researcher who specializes in researching stories, he wrote, you are both the narrator and the main character of your story. That can sometimes be a revelation. Oh, I'm not just living out this story, I'm actually in charge of this story. End quote there. So the way that this happens is that when you're telling a story, you get to pick the facts and details that you want to include. And it's not that you're, telling a lie or, but you're picking which facts are important to you. And by picking different facts, you can completely change the story arc, which of those stories that arcs that you're traveling. And as you're doing that, you realize that as you're in charge of your own story in the way that you tell it, you realize that you can also be in charge of your life in some way too, that you can have more agency in your own life. So another way that storytelling affects mental health is that it can make your story matter because it gives other people hope. So Annie Brewster, Dr. Brewster, who wrote this book, she was talking about having to give another woman a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. And the woman became very upset, and she said, well, I'll never be able to do the things that I want to do. I, work and have a family and enjoy the outdoors. My life is going to be over. And so doctors don't normally talk about themselves, but she felt that this would be the right moment to give her diagnosis. And she said that she has MS and she's working, she has children, she hikes and skis regularly. She said life is not perfect and there are some things ahead that are scary, but life didn't stop. Life has definitely gone on for her. And the patient, was visibly relieved and said she felt much better. And then Brewster wrote after that, she said, To this day, I feel certain that sharing my diagnosis was the most healing thing I could have done. So that's one of the other powers of stories, is that it makes your own story matter. I mean, it could have been a story of just illness, right? Sickness. But no, it was a story of hope for somebody else. Storytelling can also relieve the burden that carrying a secret story can have. Maya Angelou once wrote, "There is no greater agony than having an untold story inside you." Agony. Think about that. Yeah. So I think that's like wearing an uncomfortable mask all the time, right? Like people want to be seen. And if your story isn't told, you can't be sure that anyone actually sees you, that any connections you make might not be with the genuine you if you have a story that you have not told. And also, a risk factor for suicide is trauma. And a good story doesn't erase trauma, whatever that trauma might be in your background. But it can change how that trauma is perceived. And it can also change the role of the storyteller in that story, so that instead of the trauma being the main character in the story, right, you can demote the trauma to a side character and put the storyteller goes back into the main character role of that story.
Interesting way to look at it. You know, I think about how you started this conversation by saying that we are in an epidemic of loneliness, an epidemic of isolation. And when you just read that sentence, that sentiment, it took me back to that moment, you know, like we're healing each other by sharing our stories. We're connecting, which is preventing suicide in and of itself, because we know that one of the biggest risk factors is isolation, is loneliness. You know, a lot of times that is rooted in trauma, but we can change that. We can rewrite the narrative. We can rewrite our story. That's fascinating. I haven't looked at it like that before. You know, it's very interesting to take this stage of life, if you will, and we are the performers. We are the main characters, and we're part of the life that we're living. We are part of the story that we're telling.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And I did want to bring up that one of the like little asterisks on all this power of storytelling is that it's easier for some people than others to do that rewriting. If it makes a difference how closely our own stories match the larger stories of society in which we are also a part. Like it's stories within a story, right? And if our story fits well, then we can have more agency in, you know, shaping it how we want. If it doesn't, for example, if there's historical trauma, if you are part of a marginalized group, it's harder. And also, if you don't have economic means, you know, there are a lot of things that can make it harder to have agency on your own story. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's a little bit harder.
I like that you just, you know, talked about the historical traumas that are associated with marginalized communities and the access and the ability to create your own agency and to use stories to do so. Because generationally speaking, we know that cultures, ideas, traditions, all of that is shared via stories. But we also know that, again, that agency and that accessibility of that is different for those whose story doesn't match the norms. And so when we're thinking about South Dakotans sharing their story as part of this project, what makes this effective? And how can we use this effectiveness, the stories plus the statistics, this agency that we're trying to create while also fostering it of others? How can we do that? How can we use that to our advantage to create and foster a sense of humanity through this storytelling?
One of the key tenets of our suicide prevention work, and everyone's suicide prevention work, right, is that talk saves lives. This is specifically referring to talking about suicide, especially asking people that we might be concerned about, whether they are considering suicide. And as I'm sure listeners of this podcast, if they listen to more than one episode, would know, talking about suicide does not plant the idea. In fact, bringing a topic out in the open can help save lives by building connections with that person, between the two people who are talking, but then also connecting that person to life-saving resources. Can't solve a problem if you don't know it's there. If a person is in crisis or getting close to a crisis, listening to a story can sometimes diffuse that situation. We crave this listening as human beings, and sometimes being heard is all that we need. Certainly follow up with connection to professional assistance if necessary, and calling 988 is a great way to do that, a great first step. But listening to stories can be very helpful as well. Way back before we get into crisis mode, we can use stories to build up protective factors. So just a quick review on the risk factors and protective factors. So a lot of the public health work of suicide prevention is reducing the risk factors of suicide, some of which we've already discussed, like trauma in your background, or not having financial means, or lack of a support network. Those would be some of the risk factors of suicide. But then there are also protective factors. And protective factors are a little bit more interesting to me because we can work on those before we ever get to any kind of a crisis situation. And one of the strongest protective factors is building connections and having a strong social network. And as we've already discussed, stories are one of the ways that we can continue to build those connections, so that in the ups and downs of life, we all have ups and downs of life. The more protective factors you have, the less likely you're ever going to consider suicide as an option. So, if we think back to those questions in that quote from that Yaconelli book, how often do we make time for those kind of questions?
Not often enough. We certainly should be approaching life in a different way and asking these questions more often. Those are the kinds of questions that yield real stories being told. And it's what yields and creates and fosters healthy relationships that are deep and not just surface level.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Man, oh man. So speaking of, going deep and, creating relationships and stories that are not surface level, I am curious to just touch on that humanity piece again, because obviously, this project, the 30 Days, 30 Stories project, is sponsored by the South Dakota Humanities Council. And so we're partnering with them to make this all happen. So I'm curious how we, kind of foster and curate that humanity through these stories.
Well, I think it's just recognizing that as humans, we need stories, that this is how we make sense of our world. This is how we connect to one another. Storytelling is a very human thing to do. I mean, it's done if you look way back in our history, that's how we passed along all sorts of vital information, was through the telling of stories. So this is just continuing that vital tradition.
I love it. And continuing it in the hopes of, lessening that isolation, that loneliness.
Exactly.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about that humanity. I brought up that question there kind of a little off the cuff because I wanted to use it as a segue into talking about the tips and tricks and the strategies that we employ in our work as well, and how the stories and the facts and figures line up. So because of the work that we do being evidence-based and, it's rooted in data, how do you feel that 30 Days, 30 Stories uses the 7 strategies of suicide prevention outlined by the CDC that we follow in our work and kind of use as our guide map, if you will? How are we using that to collaboratively be the most effective with, the storytellers that we are working with this through this project?
I think that the key part, as we've already discussed, is building healthy connections, which is kind of strange to think about because the tellers of our stories don't typically meet the listeners of our stories who are, watching a video on their phone or reading the story on the website. But that is really the power of stories, is that we can build connections over distance and even across time. We can create that feeling of empathy, even if people aren't necessarily in the same room. We do touch on some of the other ones as well. For example, teaching coping and problem-solving skills. A lot of the storytellers talk about what has helped them and give people ideas on what other resources that they could then use in their own lives. And one of the other things that we do is really try to practice safe messaging about suicide. We try to make sure that one of the things that we really try to do is not talk about methods of suicide. That's very important. We can talk about suicide, but just not the methods. And then also we try to make sure that we use the appropriate terminology and encourage others to do that as well. The obvious one is that we try not to say committed suicide anymore, because it has those connotations of crime. And instead we talk about died by suicide is the better way to phrase that. So those are some of the ways that we're following the CDC's guidelines.
Definitely. Yeah. I kind of think about that because obviously we know that the podcast is primarily focused on the CDC's 7 strategies and how other people that we might work alongside utilize them. So I've been thinking about this a little bit, but I wanted your perspective on how this exact project kind of fit into this. So kind of rounding us out here, getting short on time, how do you believe that a digital storytelling project such as 30 Days, 30 Stories has the power to reduce the stigma surrounding suicide and prevention?
We aren't the only ones working on stigma reduction in the last few years. I mean, thankfully, there are a lot of organizations who have been really trying to just reduce the stigma around suicide and making it more acceptable to talk about mental health. For example, being able to say that your own mental health is not necessarily great, and understanding that we all may need to seek help at a certain time. And hopefully this project is definitely a part of that larger conversation of stigma reduction. The project features people from a variety of backgrounds so that hopefully anybody who hears all 30 stories will find someone that they connect with, or some piece of one story that they can connect with. And that then helps with stigma reduction, in that when you hear yourself part of your own story and somebody else's story, the details of that story then don't have the stigma that they might have had before.
Definitely. Well, thanks. In the past 3 years, we've told over 90 stories and have reached over 5 million people across our digital platforms in those 3 years. How, in your opinion, is this changing the landscape of the work that we do and the youth and young adults that we serve?
Hopefully, it's part of that larger conversation of just getting Lost and Found's name out there, but then just also getting our message out there. Some of our larger messages are suicide is preventable. We can all work together to reduce suicide, and reducing the stigma beyond that. Yeah, I guess that's what I
Perfect. And then just as we wrap up here, what's one thing that you've learned in life that you wish everyone else understood, both about communication and storytelling, and then also mental illness and suicide?
One thought that I've had while studying stories for this project is just how important stories are, which as an English major can be, which is particularly gratifying for me as someone who's gotten some grief about having a major that was not necessarily all that practical. So that's nice. And related to that, it's reminded me that asking good questions is a superpower. Having a key question and the ability to really listen to the answer, I think that can change the world one story at a time.
I feel like we have to end there. That was too perfectly said. Thank you, Heidi, so much for making the trip down. Heidi's one of our remote employees, so she doesn't make it to Sioux Falls often. But thank you so much for making the time to sit down with me and to have this conversation as we kick off the 30 Days, 30 Stories project.
Very happy to be here. Oh, I do have one little thing to add.
Yes,
if you don't
please
mind.
do.
Yes. So the stories in the project start being posted Friday, September 1st. I encourage all listeners to read them, watch the videos, and share if they are moved to do so, which frankly, I think you will be. Not every person is going to connect with every story, but I can about guarantee that there will be at least one story that will particularly affect you, and you should pass those stories on. It's one not so small act to make the world a healthier place.
Definitely. Well, thank you. That kind of leads me into where I was going, which is going to share with our listeners where they can find the 30 Days, 30 Stories project. So listeners, if you are interested in checking us out during National Suicide Prevention Month, that is September, all 30 days, we will be posting one story every day, and that will be on 30stories.org. That's 30stories.org, as well as posted on all of our social media channels at Resilient Today. So I hope that you all take some time to check this project out. It's been very close to the heart for both Heidi and I, as well as our staff and the people who are participating in the story and being vulnerable enough to share their stories. It takes bravery. So, please read these stories and share them, knowing that these people put their lives out there, their stories out there for us, and that they are doing so in the hope of reducing stigma, encouraging and empowering people to share their own stories, and to really build us up and connect to one another in a way that helps us to prevent suicide. So these people, these 30 storytellers, are helping us do more to prevent suicide. So we want to say a warm welcome and thank you to them. Just wish our best gratitudes, and make sure that you all are hyping them up by sharing these stories. So once again, that's 30stories.org. And thanks so much again, Heidi, for listening and for having this conversation. Listeners, you know what to do. Subscribe, rate, and review. And in the meantime, until our next episode, stay well. Thanks so much for listening. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review Great Minds wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information about Lost and Found, go to resilienttoday.org. That's RESILIENTTODAY.org. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Resilient Today. Until next time, do more and stay well.